Okay, in this short discussion, I wanted to talk a little bit more about women's rights after the American Revolution. And your book does do a little bit of this. I would say not very well, actually, and it spreads it out in some subsequent chapters. But I think it's actually really important to talk about this now, sort of right after the years after the American Revolution, because that's really when women really start kind of questioning what their roles will be in this new society, this new, more democratic, what they call kind of the Republican era, in which, we've now transitioned from monarchical society, in which there was like a very clear regimented hierarchy of a king and parliament and not a whole lot of participation by many people, to a republic, in which now we have a system of government in which the people are represented, they're elected officials, and it's a much more representative form of government. So, and if you recall too, during the American Revolution, women had participated in ways in which they could, through boycotts, through being members of the Daughters of Liberty. There are some women that actually did fight in the American Revolution, dressed as men and fought, and that'll happen in many wars. I mean, that's not the norm, but that did happen. So the question then becomes, how will women's roles in American society be changed by the American Revolution? And it's really women who are also being influenced by some of the new political ideas that came out of the revolution. Okay, we always have this problem. Okay. All right. Right, and just to give you a sense of this, in the years after the American Revolution, Europeans noted that America was a very different society. It was very different than European society, right? Here's a quote from a Frenchman. The United States has no aristocratic families, no courts, no kings, no bishops, right? America had been becoming, and becomes after the American Revolution, a much more egalitarian society of equals. In England, and this is kind of this statement, what he's sort of alluding to here, in England, your birth really determined your status in society. And in the Americas, that was not necessarily the case. There was a lot more potential and possibility. Whereas England was ruled by this aristocracy, right? This sort of people that had been born into an elite status, and then that status is passed down to their children. It's the same thing with kings and sort of people high in the church. America did not function in that way. You could sort of work your way up through education, through wealth, and improve your status that way. And so this was something that Europeans already commented on, but of course after the American Revolution, there was a great sense that that was even more so the case, right? That America kind of embodied this idea. Right? He wrote that whereas European society was made up of, quote, great lords who possess everything and a herd of people who have nothing, right? The United States has it has none of this, right? They have a very different society. And in the years after the American Revolution, you will see voting rights expand to more and more individuals. Initially, in the local assemblies and kind of the early systems of government that they had, only propertied, educated men could be elected to those assemblies. After the American Revolution, voting rights are extended to more individuals, and some of the property and literacy requirements were removed. It's not going to be to everyone. This is still largely white, native-born individuals who have the privileges of voting rights, but we will see it expand to more and more individuals. Women, and that's kind of where I'm taking this here, women from the beginning were excluded from voting rights, right? The idea that many people had, and you'll see this in the readings that you do that go along with this unit, the feelings that many state leaders and men in government and in society felt about women was that women were neither, that women were in some way intellectually inferior to men. And because of that, right, their place really wasn't in politics. And not only this, naturally, their natural state was not in kind of public life. It was in the home, it was raising children. And there are, right, so there's numerous examples I could give you, numerous writings on this subject, but this is a New Jersey jurist in 1799 explaining essentially, why women shouldn't vote at the time, right? So women generally are neither by nature, nor habit, nor education, nor by their necessary condition in society fitted to perform this duty with credit to themselves or advantage to the public. So this is a pretty harsh statement that this jurist has, and it's really important to kind of break down his argument here, right? He says that women are neither by nature, right? So it's not something naturally gifted to them, nor habit, right? Something that they've learned, nor education, fitted to vote. Essentially, they don't have sort of the level of education required to participate in the sort of political system. But he's also saying that it wouldn't matter even if it was something they could learn, that naturally, biologically, there's something different about women that makes them less capable of sort of the type of competence that's required for voting. And then the sort of last thing he says, right, is that they have a different, by their necessary condition in society. And there, what he's saying is basically their natural role is in the home, and they have sort of these other duties that they have to perform. So he's basically saying that, look, it wouldn't be a credit to, women wouldn't be doing themselves a favor, and they wouldn't be helping the greater good, right? The sort of the populace, which is sort of the whole idea of democracy, that everyone sort of now participates in the system. So he's just basically excluding women on a number of bases, largely their biological and natural reasons that they argued that women couldn't do this, they were incapable. So to kind of understand these concepts, these ideas of sort of why women are being excluded this early on, you have to sort of take a step back and understand the type of world that men and women were living in the 18th century and for time immemorial up until this point. All of European society, much of the Americas, women were living in a very patriarchal society. It was a patriarchal world that they inhabited. And so in that context, it almost seems like impossible that they would ever be sort of given the right to vote. It's going to take years, right? And it's going to have to chip away at this patriarchal society. So what is a patriarchal society, which most of you are probably pretty familiar with this concept? It's this idea that men basically have, men are the ones that perform the leadership roles. They have the authority in society. They have a lot more power over women. And if you sort of look back to the Puritans, you look back to religion at this time, or Christianity itself, that helps you to understand the type of world women live in. This was a world dominated by men. Men inhabited all of the positions of power, right? They were the bishops. They were the kings. There are some queens, but they were the members of parliament. When the American system is formed, they are the presidents. They are the members of Congress and Senate, right? They are the jurors, the jurists, the judges, right? This is a male-dominated society. They have all of the positions of power in that society, and largely the way this was justified was that women needed to be elsewhere. Their roles were in the private sphere. Their roles were in the home, and men's roles, while they had a special place in the home as sort of the authority over their wives and children, they had roles to play in society. So that's really important to understand, that this is the world that women lived in, and for that reason, they weren't really expected to play a role in politics or in the public sphere. That doesn't mean that women weren't, some women were not saying or trying to fight these ideas or saying that these were not right, because we have many examples of women in the past that did advocate for a greater role in society, especially after the American Revolution. Many women started to question, we're talking about liberty, we're talking about democracy, we're talking about human rights, natural rights that everyone has, that God has given you, and He didn't only give those to men. So some women are going to start talking about these things. Ultimately, though, we sort of think about this, the American Revolution, in terms of all the privileges that are gained, the American Revolution is really going to change women's lives very little. There will be a few things which I'm going to point out in this piece, in this lecture right now, but for the most part, women's lives change very little. Voting rights, for example, women won't get voting rights until the 1920s. It's going to take a very long time for women to sort of chip away at this patriarchal system. Right? And so to understand patriarchy and how this functioned, you have to understand a little bit about how women were treated in the public sphere, right? Or, what were the laws that sort of govern them? And essentially, to understand this, you have to understand that women at this time had pretty much no legal identity or personhood. A woman's legal rights were connected to the men in her life. So until a woman was married, her father sort of handled her affairs. When she was married, all of her sort of rights and representation were the responsibility of her husband. So a woman really had no legal identity. She had to sort of depend on a man in many respects to do a lot of things, right? So just to give you some examples, right? Like I said, so women have no legal identity. They could not, for example, own property. When a woman, and part of this also is the English common law system that England basically uses, and that obviously that system, when the colonists comes with them. So some of the same laws that the English had will be put into effect here in the United States. I should add that if you looked at other parts of the world, like Latin America, which fell under more of the Roman laws, women had certain privileges that English women did not have. Part of that had to do with the fact that their fathers were very important, and so they didn't lose their last name. They could acquire property and maintain it, right? But for the most part, in the English common law system, women could not own property. If, for example, a woman did come into some property, which in the English common law system, inheritance, so like when your father died, your parents died, they would leave money or property behind. It was not tradition to leave it to daughters. Traditionally, in the English system, property was left to the eldest male, and so even some sons didn't acquire money or property from their parents. But in the event, let's say, a family only has daughters or something, that a father or someone does leave property to a woman, it would be hers up until the point in which she got married. When she got married, any property or money that she had then became the property of her husband. So this is sort of an example of sort of how a woman really needed a man to be able to do these things. Women did not have custody rights over their children. So in the event of a widowhood or separation, or your husband runs off and leaves you, most judges did not award custody to mothers. Custody was always awarded in the favor of fathers. Part of the reason for this was that, this is a time in which women did not work, women did work, let me say that, but there were very few reputable ways for a woman to earn wages. And in fact, like I said on the first one, technically a woman who earned wages, they were not her own wages. They belonged to her husband. So part of the reason why they always gave custody to fathers was because the belief was that a man could provide for them financially. So this is another reason why women would not push for or want separations or divorces. They're not available at this point, but when they do become available, it's not very popular because you lose custody of your children. A woman could not enter into a legal contract. She could not, this would prevent her from purchasing things or suing someone, any sort of, so again, no legal rights. She has very, very little legal rights. She would have to, if you were disputing something or suing someone, you would have to have your father, your husband, or in the case that you don't have either one of those, your father's passed, you never marry, whatever the case, you're widowed, you would have to have a male guardian sign for you in any sort of legal contracts or legal documents, right? So you had no real identity. You could not accept wages, like I said first. Any money, anything belonged to your husband or to your father, or to your male guardian. Should you not have, you had to have someone sort of manage your affairs. You could not sue or be sued. A woman could not be a witness in a courtroom. She could not give testimony, right? So you'd have to have someone do it on your behalf. Right? So there's all sorts of limitations that were placed on women legally, and so this sort of really prevented many women from being able to do a whole lot in the public sphere, even if they wanted to. Right? For this reasons, husbands, male guardians, fathers had considerable power over their wives and children, as well as in legal and the financial matters of the household. For the most part, these laws will not change as a result of the American Revolution. There will, however, be some changes, some cultural changes, in which that I think if you look at them and you sort of evaluate how they affected women, that they did have a positive, in many instances, positive effect on women in the way they begin to be viewed. And it's sort of the first steps in a very long process of eventually changing some of these laws. But it's going to take a very long time. The other thing was divorce, which you don't see here. Divorce was not widely available. It was very rare. If you were Catholic, it didn't exist. And we'll talk about some of the changes that affect marriage in a minute, right? But nonetheless, despite the fact that there won't be a whole lot of changes really being pushed by these men that are the new legislatures, women are going to start to take heed, and they hear the message of the revolution, of these ideas that are kind of around about liberty and natural rights, God-given rights, and so some women are going to start talking about them, right? Here's a famous quote by John Adams, whose wife, by the way, Abigail Adams, was actually very involved in his political career, and many people say they were kind of like a duo in a lot of ways. He really looked to her for a lot of advice. John Adams talked about the fact that the revolution and its ideas have spread where it was not intended. So women starting to talk about this. Not only women, but slaves started to take up some of the revolutionary language and start to advocate for their own rights as well. So it's starting to spread into the revolution was not intended to be as radical as some people think it was, but some people will take it to heart, right? And women are one of them. So in the readings for this unit, I think it will give you a better sense of this idea, because women are really going to start talking about why they now deserve greater rights in this new society. And you should definitely make sure you pay attention to some of those arguments. One woman in particular, Mercy Otis Warren, she was a writer and a historian. She argued that patriarchy, in the way that it's been explained, the way that it's been accepted into society was not natural in the way that men tried to often argue that it was this is somehow the way women were born and sort of the position they should hold. She argued, in fact, that it was a way of controlling women, a way of sort of keeping them out of these spaces that men did not want them in, that, it's not natural, it's not biological, this is just the way man has basically made it. As a way to basically maintain order, keep control of the family and all of these sorts of things. And so for her, that was in question. You should read what some of the other women are saying in the readings as well. One of the areas that we do start to see some change for women, and it was a direct result of the American Revolution, was in marriage, right? Up until the 1820s, most states did not allow divorce. There was no system, no system in place to acquire a divorce. But by the 1820s, divorce and women in particular will advocate for the rights to divorce, will begin to spread. So by the 1820s, all states except South Carolina had legal divorce laws. Up until the 1820s and before, and even after, even once divorce is legal, it's still not it's not very common. It won't become common until the last 30, 40 years. But divorce, for many women, it was difficult to get out of an unwanted marriage. For men, it was a little bit easier to acquire divorce. Women had to provide a lot of proof and evidence. And typically, in these cases, if you read some of the detail of them, there were very few divorce cases very few couples that were actually granted a divorce, despite appeals. But in the cases that women were awarded a divorce, it was usually for extreme abuse. And that was the only, adultery didn't necessarily ensure that a woman could get a divorce. It's not like today where you can just sort of say, you know what, we've both mutually decided this isn't working. That's not the way it worked. Women often had to stay in very unhappy arrangements. Even if your husband had left you and sort of abandoned you, it was very difficult for a woman to get a divorce. And without a divorce, it was then very difficult to sort of do anything because your husband was far away or not there. And so it really tied women down in some instances. Men, however, could get divorces much easier for things like adultery and lesser things, not being able to consummate the marriage, not being able to have children. These were other reasons why people wanted to have access to divorce. But again, like I said, for a woman, divorce is a last resort because marriage at this time is very important to a woman. It's her only access to rights. It's her only source, in many instances, it's her only source of useful income, because it was very difficult for women to make good enough wages to be able to support themselves, let alone if they had any children. So divorce, the cases that you would see of divorce at this time would have been extreme. And the social consequences of being a divorced person, this is someone who, to be divorced, it's not like having children out of wedlock, it's not that sort of shame, but it's not something that you want to be, a divorced person. This is a society in which really praises marriage and family. And the other factor was that you would lose custody of your children. So this is not something that women sought lightly. It was something that was for extreme circumstances. But the fact that by the 1820s it's now at least available is sort of a step forward. And it was in many instances, it was women. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who's very popular in the women's rights movement and the voting rights movement for women, she was one of the early advocates of sort of being able to attain divorces for women. Kind of another feature that's kind of interesting about this time period, which happens a little bit later, and this is really a result of the Second Great Awakening, is the reasons for marriage, right? Today, I think most people understand that marriage is something that you it's consensual. It's something that, you only enter into marriage with someone you love, right? These are sort of ideas that are kind of modern. Prior to this, a lot of marriages were arranged. Fathers had a lot of control over who you married. And if you think about this, why would fathers want to do this? Why was this more common? Well, because status and social class was really important, and because, once your daughter married, that was pretty much it. That was going to determine her life for the rest of her life, is sort of who this person she chooses. Fathers often wanted to marry their daughters off to a good match. That would be good for the family, right? To kind of elevate the status or maintain the status of a family. But also because they wanted to ensure the well-being of their daughters, because there's very little recourse for women other than marriage. So there's a number of reasons why fathers had a lot of control in who you married. But what we start to see is the influence of sentimentalism, romanticism, right? In advocating that, marriage isn't just sort of this social contract where we, make the best rational choice. Romanticism, which is part of the sentimental movement, which is part of the Second Great Awakening and all the things you sort of will see in some of the chapters you read in the text. Romanticism really emphasized the importance of human emotion, right? And when it came to marriage and sort of relationships, it really emphasized this notion of love. And so you really start to see this idea present in a lot of the literature, the theater plays, even religion, which is sort of the evangelical movements of that time period during the Second Great Awakening. The sort of emphasis on romantic love, that you can't marry another individual who you do not love or have some sentimentality toward. And it's not necessarily a new concept, right? People have loved each other before, but the fact that it's an absolute requirement for marriage is kind of new, right? So this kind of, and what many people call it is love marriages, right? That sort of love becomes part of the essential equation in a marriage. Here's an example, John Keats. John Keats is a poet of the Romantic era, sort of very, very well-known Romanticism era poet. All of his poems deal with the love of his, sort of this woman that he falls in love with, and she's sort of the subject of all of his poems. Right, so there's definitely now this emphasis on love. And kind of interesting point about Romanticism is that Romanticism was kind of a rejection of the Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment had really emphasized the mind. There's sort of a newfound understanding of science. It was very rational. It's about thinking things through, making very rational, logical decisions. And Romanticism, and this is sort of where religion came in, was kind of a rejection of all of that and saying, it's not always about what you think in your head. It's about sort of what you feel in your heart. And these things are important. So for that reason, and sort of in the religious standpoint, religion became much more emotional too. So that's when a lot more of the music is introduced into the services, the worship, the much more lively worship services are introduced kind of in the evangelical movements. This is like the Baptists and the African Methodist Church. All of these sort of movements kind of came out of Romanticism and sentimentalism, part of the Second Great Awakening, of sort of emphasizing a very emotional relationship with God that, the Puritans were not doing. They're not singing and praising and worshiping in church. It's a very different type of worship. It's a much more solemn, serious, not that Romanticism was not serious, but it's a different style, right? Because it's a different belief in sort of what's important. But getting back to romantic love, so this is another thing that I think is kind of interesting, because it's once Romanticism starts to emphasize this idea of love, and they're writing about this in literature and poems and plays, young people are seeing and reading about these ideas, and it's starting to influence the culture. And this is kind of important because it starts to change the way women will view marriage, and young men start to view marriage and relationships. This is a painting. It's called The Marriage, and it kind of shows you can kind of see in the earlier painting, that's sort of more serious Puritan marriage. And then kind of later, this is by 1820, definitely by the time period we're talking about, you see a much more emotional scene, right? So you see the two young couple, and they're looking at each other, they're touching one another, they look very much in love. You have all of the other family members gathered. This woman looks like she's crying, right? Sort of an emotional experience. And so marriage definitely starts to be viewed differently by young people and the society as a whole. And this is kind of important because what many people argue is that romantic love gave women a greater role in obviously choosing their own partner, but also in kind of breaking down a little bit of that patriarchal society that we had. Because in the patriarchal society, if you recall, men had a lot more control, and in particular fathers. Whereas fathers had once arranged marriages, now young people are saying, no, I'm not going to marry so-and-so because it's a good match, or, whatever it might be. I can't because I don't love him, right? This is who I love. So young people are kind of becoming more independent, and they're demanding their rights or their privileges. And that's a good example in through love marriage that people often talk about. Right? So some people also say, this is also making women a little more equal to their brothers, per se, right? Because they're demanding, they're basically saying, yes, my father has control over my life until a point, and then at a certain point, I make decisions for my own life. And so being able to choose your own husband is one of those ways that they could do that. Despite that, once they are married, the laws are not changing. Their husbands still have a lot of control. But if you've been able to choose your husband, and this is someone that you supposedly love and that loves you back, it may allow you to have a more egalitarian marriage as well. Because if your husband sort of views marriage in the same way of sort of love, you may choose a kinder mate or a kinder partner that is going to be more willing to make decisions with you. That's not necessarily how it always worked, but that's kind of, in theory, what could potentially happen when you can choose your own partner. So that's one example. So marriage is one example where we do see some influence of the revolution, right? So the importance of love marriages, many people saw it as a type of rebellion against patriarchy and patriarchal authority. The other thing, it's kind of symbolic of the Republican era in general. After the American Revolution, there's that emphasis on breaking away and being independent, and you see these young people also doing that as well. The other thing, too, is that it could give women some more equality in the family, in their relationships. Okay, the other sort of point that you read about in the unit is education. And this is really kind of key because this is one of the huge things that will change after the American Revolution, especially in the years after the war from 1790 to 1830. There is this, not just for women but for everyone, this belief that education is really important in a democratic society, right? One of the reasons why they argued this was that now, right, this is a society in which people vote. And if people are going to be voting, we want those people to be educated. We want them to sort of we want the people that are making decisions for the whole country to be a literate and educated citizenry so that they can make good decisions for the good of the country. And so there's definitely this emphasis after the revolution on the need for public education, access to education. All right, so that was the goal of education. Initially, in the early years of public education, most children and girls in particular only attended summer sessions. Schooling would have been mostly from young, 6 to 11. So this is basically like elementary, early middle school, and then that's it. Most of the education that would have been provided to girls was pretty basic. Basic reading, basic math. Boys, while some boys might have finished school also at the same time and only had a basic education as well, if they were farmers or had other trades that they learned from their fathers, some men had the opportunity to go on to higher education. They would be learning things beyond basic reading and basic math. They'd be learning chemistry and physics and studying philosophy, and they'd be sort of had the opportunity for more advanced study. While education for girls was largely pretty basic. Between 1790 and 1830, we will start to see the options of education opening up for women. And this is when we'll start to see the rise of kind of the female academies, which you read about in this unit as well. These academies were mostly for, wealthier children, wealthier girls. Initially, kind of the goal, and here's one of the ones that you read about, the Troy Female Seminary in upstate New York. The goal of these institutions was to give women a basic education, but also to kind of like refine, like what they called female gentility, what you might think of as like becoming a lady, these sorts of things. That's what these schools were intended to do. In addition to kind of coursework, there would be classes in drawing, needlework, music, French, literature, history, geography, elocution or pronunciation. And so some of them were focused more on this. And kind of the idea behind these early academies was that you wanted to have well-educated girls who would become good spouses for well-educated men, right? So they could hold their own in conversation with men and be able to entertain an educated group of individuals. And so that was kind of the idea, and so they were mostly elite. What you start to see by the 1820s, though, in which you see in the readings, which they talk about some of them, or some of these institutions are going to be more about academics. They're going to offer much more advanced curriculum. By the 1820s, some of these female academies were offering as rigorous offerings as the male schools, as Harvard and Yale. Women at these female academies were studying philosophy and Latin, logic, algebra. Two of the best known were like the Troy Female Academy and the Hartford Seminary in Connecticut. And you can read more in the unit on the readings about these. For the most part, though, most of these girls attending these schools were not going to be able to just, they're not like the men at Harvard and the men at Yale and Princeton. They're not going to be able to graduate and go out and actually use their degrees. For the most part, there's no career opportunities for women. So kind of the only option for these girls once they graduated from these schools was to go into teaching. And that's kind of primarily what many of them were doing, was training teachers. And then, of course, a woman might teach for a certain amount of time. She might go back to the Troy Female Seminary and become a teacher. But for many of them, they were eventually going to marry and then give up their careers altogether. So it's not necessarily, these academies weren't necessarily intended to create professionals like today. Women go to college and they become the same things that men do. That wasn't necessarily the case. And that brings us to our final point that I want to talk about. The other kind of big change that comes out of the Republican era, and when I say Republican era and what many people mean by Republican era, is the period after the American Revolution, in which our form of government becomes a Republican form of government, meaning that it's a republic, it's democratic, right? It's kind of participatory. It has a participant citizenry that participates in the process. So this is sort of often how it's defined as kind of the Republican era. like I said, so largely what most women are still going to be doing is becoming wives and mothers. And the kind of the biggest change that will happen, that we will see, is the introduction of this idea of Republican motherhood. And this is something that the textbook introduced a little later on, so you can kind of just keep it in the back of your mind. But what many people are going to start to argue is that, okay, yes, we need to educate women to be good partners for their husbands, but in this new Republican society, which is based on democracy and voting public, a mother's role has kind of changed, right? Because we want our children to be good, virtuous citizens. We want them to be educated, and if in this society, you know, whose primary goal is raising children? It's women. And so after the American Revolution, there's definitely this push that says that if we want to have good, virtuous children that are well educated, that grow up to be good citizens, good voting members of society, then it's important that their mothers be educated. So that was another argument that people made for the reason why women should become educated, was so that they could use those skills to educate her children, to be like a good model for her children, particularly her sons, because those are the ones that would go on and vote and participate in society, but also her daughters, because you want them to be virtuous members of a society, right? This is the kind of whole idea of a democracy and of this new kind of society that America has created. It really kind of depends on the good of the whole to make it all work, much like kind of the Puritans viewed their communities. So this kind of adds a dimension to women's lives in that, yes, now they are they're going to have more opportunities because they're going to be able to go to school and receive more education. But and so in that sense, it gives them a great deal. This is a newfound kind of respect and appreciation for what women do and for motherhood in general, and kind of seeing this as a very important and critical role in a child's life. At the same time, it kind of adds a burden, an additional dimension to women's lives, because prior to this, it was kind of men and women who raised the children, or at least raised and educated them. Men had a really important role in kind of the religious teachings of their children and all of that. So it kind of adds both a dimension of respect, but also responsibility and potentially blame, when those kids maybe don't grow up to be so virtuous or educated. So a lot more responsibility can now fall on mothers than previously. There's a lot more information that I would normally talk about in this lecture in a regular classroom, but I think you can read some more about more about that in the textbook. It does sort of do a little more. It doesn't do as much as I think it should. I think women's sort of history and sort of understanding these concepts are really important. But eventually, kind of walk you through the rest of this, eventually some of these ideas are going to lead to the advocacy of public school, mandatory public school. We won't see that until the 1850s. And the first compulsory, meaning required, mandated school will be in Massachusetts. But really, you won't see all of the United States having mandatory schooling until the early 1900s, 1920s. Other things, so even though women, there's very few professions for women. Teaching was the biggest one. If you were an educated woman, you become a teacher. But often an underlooked role that women had was as midwives, and that's an important role that women will have well into the 19th century, until you start to see Western scientific medicine kind of taking over the practice of birthing babies. But up until that point, women were the primary participants in all of the process, from birthing the child to caring for it afterward. It's really a woman's domain, was childbearing and child rearing. I'm not going to get into this too much. Women's lives will obviously also be changing by the 1800s as we introduce greater and greater industrial growth into the United States. Women are going to work in factories, and especially young women, women who don't come from wealthy families are going to start working in the factories, and particularly the textile mills in New England. And so other occupations will open up for women. Always the lowest paid. I mean, factory work for women. Women ran the looms and the textile mills. It was very low paid work. Men were the machinists. They made a lot more when they worked in these factories. And usually it was young girls. You can see on the left some of the mill girls. So it was very low paid. Other occupations that will open up as the United States becomes more industrial are things like maids, servants, washwomen, cooks, these sorts of domestic type work. And then, of course, as the United States becomes much more industrial, things like prostitution also increase in the United States. By the 1820s, prostitution was rampant in cities. New York City, for example, had over 200 brothels. By the 1820s, by the 1850s, there's like 500 brothels in New York City. And up until this point, prostitution is fully legal in the United States. And for that reason, it was pretty much female dominated. I mean, the brothels would have been run by a madam, so they were female run. And then usually the madams were like women who had aged out of prostitution, and then they had younger girls working in the brothels. There's some interesting books and studies on prostitution at this time too. I mean, prostitution should not be like glorified by any means, but it's important to understand, what happens to these women that sort of don't come from a wealthy or elite family, or what happens to these women that do end up having children and they're not married, or that sort of are abandoned by their families or abandoned by spouses. Well, in many cases, the options are not good for you. You're going to be in very low paid work in a society that, doesn't really sort of have a whole lot of opportunities for a woman without a husband. Women often fell into undesirable jobs. Prostitution, even though it was very undesirable and very shameful, a woman who became a prostitute would have been the lowest on the social class. You would have lost all sense of social status. She would have made more money than someone who working as a maid or someone working as a washerwoman. So this was something that sometimes women fell into out of necessity. Let's see. And again, there's, while a woman would have suffered a complete loss of status to become a prostitute, there was no kind of social pressure or culture of shame for men who visited brothels. So while a prostitute would have been a very low class, low status woman, all classes of men visited brothels in the 19th century. And it was socially acceptable for men to do so, even married men. This is a picture on the right of New York City, Broadway. Women prostitutes would often hang out on the third, very high up in the balconies, kind of advertising, themselves, I guess, in the theater. Theater was not seen as something, not all theater was very reputable. You had vaudeville and some of those things that were more risque. Most female prostitutes in New York City were young women. They were between the ages of 15 and 25. Because this is unprotected sex, this is a high-risk job, even though you could make more money. Half of all women that were prostitutes in New York City at this time were infected with syphilis. The other half had children. So, I guess the point here is that life is pretty difficult for women in the 19th century, and not a whole lot of opportunities, at least financially, opened up for women as a result of the American Revolution. But some things are changing, and it's going to take time. It's a process that women will slowly work away at. And as you can see today, society is very, very different in the way they view women. And but again, this is sort of something that's going to take a long, long time. Some of the areas that we do see some change are things like marriage and divorce laws sort of changing, and women being in education, obviously, too. So that concludes this discussion. Like I said, there are some readings in this unit and some of the kind of readings assigned in the textbook that you should also review that will kind of fill in the gaps. Again, these are not intended to be chapter reviews. They're more intended to be like, let's talk about a theme and let's kind of talk about it in more detail.